Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today about the archive of the Ffestiniog Railway Company. Now, it is of course a challenge that every archaeologist with an interest in the archaeology of literate societies, and in particular of the industrial and modern period, let's say from the 18th century onwards, how to integrate documentary evidence, which may be in archival form, with the material evidence. This is not a challenge that applies to prehistorians, but if we address the archaeology of modern society, it becomes of paramount importance. So a major industrial collection, like the archive of the Ffestiniog Railway Company, is going to be of particular interest to historians and archaeologists, but I suggest that this is an unusually interesting collection in that it is still being used to inform the operation and the conservation of this historic railway system to this day. Let me tell you a little bit about the Ffestiniog Railway Company. It was established in 1832 to construct and then to operate a railway from the slate quarries of Ffestiniog to connect them with the harbour at Porthmadog. The railway company now also operates the Welsh Highland Railway, which runs from Porthmadog to Carnarvon, making them together the longest narrow gauge railway in the United Kingdom. They both operate at the same 2-foot gauge, and both of them use historic steam locomotives, some of which date back to the 1860s, the very first locomotives put on the Ffestiniog Railway, as well as historic carriages and wagons. Here's a map of the system. You can see Gwyn and Ffestiniog, where the quarries are located, on the right of the map. You can see the Ffestiniog Railway following a circuitous course down the Dwyrid Valley, across the Cob, the embankment at Porthmadog, to the harbour, and you can see the Welsh Highland Railway in blue extending north from Porthmadog, making its way to Beddgelert, onto Rhydd, onto Waenfawr, to Dinas, and to Carnarvon. So it is an extensive system. Its archive, not surprisingly, reflects this very long and complicated story. Not only does it include the records of the company directors' deliberations, it includes mechanical matters, it includes the railway's relationship with the slate quarries, with shipping organisation, with the local community, with mechanical matters. All of these are covered in the archive. And the archive, as you might expect, includes not merely paper documentation, but historic plans, maps, and photographs, some of which go back to the 1870s. Now, the archive of the railway is particularly important in understanding the development of the slate industry, not only around Gwyn and Ffestiniog, but the smaller quarries in the Croeso Valley and along the route of the Welsh Highland Railway. So these were all served by what is now the one railway. The railways, of course, had to maintain close relations with the quarries, the source of most of their traffic, the source of most of their profit, until the early years of the 20th century. So they cover output of different quarries, they cover all the problems of moving this particular commodity down the line, and as such we get a very clear picture from the Ffestiniog archive of how this industry developed and of how ultimately it went into decline. The archive also tells us a very great deal about the onward transfer of slate once it reached the ports, mainly Porthmadog, though there was some export of slate from Carnarvon as well. Most of the slate from Porthmadog went all over the world in these very small two-masted or three-masted sailing ships. And of course the mariners, the captains, the crews had to maintain a very close relationship with the quarry owners who maintained the quays, but also with the railway, because they were the people who were bringing the slate down, they were the people who were stacking the slate on the quays and relying on these sailing ships to take their cargoes elsewhere. It's also the case that the area was not very densely populated until the Industrial Revolution, until the late 18th, early 19th century, and when it does become a focus for population, many of these communities were actually established along the route of the railway. Now here's Ffestiniog, the largest town that the railways serve, and this is a formally laid out settlement. It nevertheless has as its effective backbone the Ffestiniog Railway. It was built alongside an earlier, pre-existing transport network which enabled production in the quarries to develop and to thrive, and it's only gradually thereafter that the town comes into being. So the archive is therefore a most important source for the social development of this region. Now, the railway, the town of Ffestiniog, and the slate quarries at Ffestiniog all form part of a World Heritage Site. So this gives an added value to the archive. There is a technical story here as well, which is very important in that they illustrate the evolution of these systems from horse-drawn days, when they relied entirely on the slate trade for their revenue, through the era of steam traction, through the period of decline and closure, and their ultimate revival in the late 20th century as visitor attractions. Now, images of the Ffestiniog Railway when it was horse-drawn are sadly not very common, but here is one of the most compelling. It dates from 1849, and it shows a team of 3 horses drawing a train of full slate wagons across the cob at Porthmadog. The wagons will have come down by gravity on the constant gradient of the railway, and the horses will have been riding in wagons at the back of the train until this point where the railway becomes level, and they will have been taken out of their wagons and hitched to the train to draw it the final 3/4 of a mile or so into the harbour at Porthmadog. Once steam locomotives were installed on the Ffestiniog Railway, the first 4 arrived in 1863, 1864, photography becomes much more common. And here is a very early view of the Princess, one of the batch of the first 4 locomotives, coupled to a train of small 4-wheeled carriages at Porthmadog Station, about to take passengers up to Ffestiniog. You can see in the background as well, of course, the masts of ships. Now, this was how the railway began with steam, but so intense was the volume of traffic that within a few years the railway was introducing these innovative double locomotives. Here's the first of them, Little Wonder, effectively, you might say, 2 locomotives built back to back with articulated power bogies, and Little Wonder is pulling a train first of goods wagons, then of passenger carriages, and then, as you can perhaps see in the distance, a long rake of empty slate wagons making its way up the line across Creau Bank, this impressive stone-built causeway, towards Ffestiniog. Now, the glory days of the Ffestiniog Railway, of the Welsh Highland Railway, did not last for long. Here is a view of the upper terminus of the Ffestiniog Railway, when a very short section is still seeing some short-haul traffic from the quarries there in the background to the main line railway, but you can see that the old passenger station on the right is no longer in use. It's been turned, in fact, into a public convenience. The Welsh Highland Railway was completely scrapped, the rails were lifted, and few people ever thought that it might spring into being, either it or the Ffestiniog might ever carry passengers again. But just to show that it could be done, here's a wonderful recent slide showing a Santa special at Waenfawr station on the Welsh Highland Railway, so people enjoying a trip out on the train just before Christmas. And of course it illustrates very neatly the way that the railway has transformed from a largely industrial undertaking to one serving tourism. Now, the archive is an excellent chronicle of this process, but where I think it's unusual and interesting is the way in which it's also being used now to inform conservation on the railway system. Take, for instance, this architect's plan, which dates to 1874, which shows the goods shed at Minffordd, the point at which some of the slates were transferred from the narrow gauge Ffestiniog Railway to the main line railway. You can see a cross-section on the left of the broader gauge of the main line system, 4 foot 8.5 inches at a lower level, and on the right hand side at a slightly higher level you can see a cross-section, the sleeper and the two rails from the 2 foot gauge. In between them is a raised platform and the post for a swivel crane that will transfer goods from one to the other. Now have a look at this photograph of the goods shed undergoing conservation work a few years ago. It might give you an idea about how the higher standards of conservation have been informed by this wonderful archival record. Not only as well in conservation, this is a carriage known to its devotees as the curly-roofed van, which was a casualty of the railway's decline in the interwar period. But because detailed plans survive of this vehicle, it became possible to set about a reconstruction project where the carriage has been constructed to the original design, the original specification, on the basis of what we knew about it. Now, the railway retains many of its historic slate wagons. These were quite literally what made the railway a profitable organisation for well over 100 years. Plans of the wagons survive in the archives, and here you see some of the restored wagons making their way down the Ffestiniog Railway by gravity, as all the slate trains did from 1836 to 1940. So the Railways Archive is an excellent source for conservation of the mechanical and technical aspects of its history. Not just the technical aspects either. Staff records tell us a very great deal about the way in which the railway had an impact on the local community. As people came in to work on the railway, some from the North Wales region, some from further afield. Some specialist workers, like engine drivers, had to be recruited from further afield. But in the main, it was a very local railway, employing local people. And here is a wonderful photograph of the passenger guard Ellis Lewis, who began work on the railway at the age of 13 and lived long enough to see the railway being revived. And here he is looking very proud of himself indeed in his frock coat uniform, his watch and chain, and his badge of office, the green flag. So there is a very strong social dimension to these documents as well, and there is the capacity for a lot of local history research to be undertaken on this basis. Now, most of the earlier documents, particularly those relating to the first period of the railway's operation from 1832 until closure in 1946, are available in the Carnarvon Record Office, which is run by Gwyn County Council. So it's an easy matter to come and consult the catalogues and have a look at any documents that interest you. In the meantime as well, the railway is making efforts to scan particularly its photographic archive. If you log on to their iBase website, you can do a search on photographs that might interest you, and you can see that we've made significant strides here with putting these on the database. There's a great deal of work still to do. the core business of the railway is running a railway, but enthusiastic and informed volunteers have been giving us all a great deal of help with the process of cataloguing, of transferring materials to the record office, identifying exactly what is shown in the photographs. And I think it's unusual the extent to which the railway still relies on these documents from the 19th century, from maybe 150 years ago in many cases, to keep its operations going and to preserve its historic character. So an unusual and comprehensive and I think fascinating archive. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening. That is a brief overview of the archive of the Ffestiniog Railway Company. Diolch yn fawr. Diolch am wrando.